For this next one, it's going to sound like I'm talking external comms at first, and I am, but don't worry, I'll bring it back. Golin tracks the public communications activity of the top 250 Fortune 500 CEOs through their CEO Impact Index. And the 2025 numbers are interesting. Those 250 CEOs collectively lost nearly 3 trillion earned media impressions compared to 2024. 90% of that came from pulling back from traditional media. The silence didn't protect them. It just created a vacuum that filled with other narratives. And for those that are in internal comms, this is a version of a story we already know. The political dimension is hard to ignore. Donald Trump was the single biggest topic appearing alongside Fortune 250 CEOs in 2025, cited in 17.3% of earned coverage, which beat AI at 9%. 68% of CEOs had DEI, climate, immigration, and political alignment service as a meaningful factor in their public engagement. The approach that held up best per Golin was what they call, quote unquote, engagement without endorsement. This is framing decisions in business terms rather than political ones. That also sounds weak AF. Their read, CEO, silence on social issues, quote, doesn't build a shield, it reallocates risk. There's that risk word again. The AI finding is the one with the most direct IC relevance. 86% of CEOs now reference AI in public communication, but the news has shifted from opportunity to workforce cuts, which we've talked about on here. Golin is blunt, leading with, quote unquote, we're cutting jobs because of AI generates real sentiment liability. Organizations just anchored that in that message and reskilling our product innovation fared considerably better. This is not a PR lesson. It applies to how internal comms teams are also handling AI narratives internally. Jenny, what else can internal comms learn from this Golin data?
So it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think it's really telling that story about silence, and it's telling the story about the importance of how you message something, maybe thinking you're mitigating risk, but there's unintended consequences. And I think we see that so much in internal comms. The AI stuff we talked about, I think either last week or the week before, about that, how you're framing that has a direct impact on adoption and stuff. And I think this is kind of referencing the same. I think the silence stuff is interesting. I think the silence piece around the fact that it's just created other people to step into that space. And I think from an internal comms perspective, you've got to think about that. If you're not speaking on some of those digital channels that you might have, if I think about various, I'm not going to name any, but if you think about all of the various different ways and platforms that exist where you can communicate internally, if you stop doing that or you're not visible there as a leader, someone else is going to fill that space. And I think that's something to reflect on in terms of the impact that has here as well. So there's definitely something about risk, silence, and framing that I think this is relevant for internal comms.
I think this goes back also to that neutrality thing that we talked about earlier. Whereas if you're safe, that's not a shield. You're just putting that risk somewhere else. And I think that shows the weakness of some leaders willing to put that onto others instead of themselves. We talked about that with what was happening in Minneapolis with ICE and the way the kind of the weak message of some of those leaders that came out. I think that's what people want from their CEO, COO, whoever it is that's out there speaking. I think the other part that was interesting to me was the fact that Donald Trump mentions nearly doubled AI, which if you're saying you want to play it safe, I wouldn't mention Donald Trump in your communication. So it's really interesting to see that this is the top of the top CEOs, not from a performance level, but from a large organization standpoint. I think this just shows that pulling back from traditional media, like you said, that's creating a vacuum that's going to be filled with something else.
Yeah. And I think we always have to remember that sort of mantra or phrase, which I heard a long time ago, and I don't know where it started from, but if you're saying yes to one thing, you're saying no to something else. If you're saying no to that, you're saying yeah. And I think sometimes we forget that. Like, we're very good to say yes and yes and yes and do more and more without thinking about what you're then saying no to. But equally, if you're going to say no to stuff, then what are you doing instead? So I don't know whether with the silence meant people were going off doing something else and that had a bigger impact. So it's that trade-off that I think we have to be mindful of.
Imagine if that 90% pulling back from traditional media, they then spent that time internally. What a difference that would make.
Yes, they
inside
haven't done that.
organizations.
I'm
They have not
pretty
done
sure
that.
that they have not done. No, I'm not sure
have
that's
not
where
done
they
that.
went.
They have not done that.